This is a story of betrayal, mistreatment, and a justice system working to piece together the final weeks of a little boy's life. Before we begin, I want to warn you this case involves detailed descriptions of child endangerment. It might be disturbing, so discretion is advised. To understand this tragedy, we need to first understand the family dynamics at play. Jaylen Ramsey was a 3-year-old boy living with his mother and his aunt, Lettice Ramsey. He also lived with Lettice's 2 children, aged 4 and 8, and by all accounts, Jaylen was a healthy child. He attended regular pediatric checkups and had no ongoing health problems. Now, Jaylen's father, Reginald Tumlin, was not a constant presence in the boy's life. According to testimony, Jaylen would stay with his father for maybe 2 days once every 2 months. This wasn't a father who was deeply involved in the day-to-day parenting. He was more of an occasional visitor in his life. But Reginald wasn't just an absent father. He was a man with an extensive criminal history. His rap sheet read like a career criminal's resume: possession of drugs, vehicular homicide, aggravated assault, possession of cocaine, carrying contraband into a penal institution, and burglary. This was a man who lived on the wrong side of the law, and by April 2010, he was already aware that there were pending warrants for his arrest. Reginald lived with his girlfriend Shamika Greer, and together they had what can only be described as a chaotic household. Reginald himself had 8 children. I don't even have 8 friends. He had twin 7-year-old boys, a 6-year-old, Jaylen, 2 4-year-old girls, and twin 1-year-old girls. And that explains the 8. A lot of them came at once. None of these children lived with him full time, but 2 of them stayed most of the time. Shamika worked at Church's Chicken to support the household, while Reginald, by his own admission, sold drugs for income. They had moved between 3 different locations between November 2009 and April 2010. The kind of transient lifestyle that often accompanies those trying to stay one step ahead of the law. The children who did stay at Reginald's house were described as engaging in rough play. They would wrestle, they would run, they would jump off the beds, they would play on bicycles and motorized vehicles. According to both Reginald and Shamika, this rough play was normal, even expected. But in April 2010, something would change that would put little Jaylen in harm's way. The events that would lead to Jaylen's death began innocuously enough. In April 2010, Reginald approached Lettice Ramsey at a store and asked her if Jaylen was with her. When she confirmed that Jaylen and her cousin were in the car, Reginald made what seemed like a reasonable request. He wanted Jaylen to stay with him for Easter because he had bought the boy an outfit and wanted to take him to see Reginald's mother. Lettice contacted Jaylen's mother and got permission, and Jaylen went with his father for what was supposed to be a brief Easter visit. At this point, according to Lettice's testimony, Reginald didn't have any visible injuries on him, a detail that would become significant later. But the Easter visit didn't end when Easter was over. According to testimony, Jaylen's mother and Reginald agreed Jaylen should continue staying with his father so that Reginald could potty train him. The family had been having difficulty with potty training, and Jaylen's mother thought that perhaps his father, being a man, might be more successful. This decision would prove to be fatal. From April 4th, 2010 until May 1st, 2010, nearly a month, Jaylen remained in his father's custody. During this time, Jaylen's mother called to check on him only twice. 2 calls in a month. What the hell? Reginald would tell her to let Jaylen stay a little while longer. I've almost got him potty trained. But what was really happening during those weeks in Reginald's house was far from normal parenting or potty training. It was systematic mistreatment that cost Jaylen his life. To understand what Jaylen endured during his final weeks, we need to examine the environment he was living in. Reginald's household was one where violence was normalized under the guise of play. According to Shamika, the children engaged in rough play. She had seen Reginald sink his teeth into Jaylen. though she claimed it was in a playful way. She even admitted that Reginald sunk his teeth into her as well, saying, "Dad's teeth, I've got teeth marks on me." This casual acceptance of teeth as normal behavior is deeply disturbing when you consider what happened later. Reginald himself would later admit to police he chews everyone and that his play with Jaylen included wrestling and chewing, but the evidence would show that what Reginald called play was actually mistreatment. During this time, other adults were occasionally present in the home. Reginald's sister, Calandra Tumlin, and his cousin Bruce, but none of these adults seemed to recognize or report the escalating abuse that was occurring. The house itself, as documented by crime scene investigators, contained space heaters and other potential hazards. It was in this environment that Jaylen would sustain a serious brain injury that should have been a red flag to any adult. According to Shamika's testimony, Jaylen was scorched when he bumped on the heater. She claimed she was basing him because he had wet himself, and when she noticed he was cold, she turned on a space heater. But later that day, she noticed blistering on the back of his leg. This was second degree that required medical attention, but Jaylen never received it. Instead, Shamika simply put ointment on it and bandaged it. This mark alone should have prompted a trip to the emergency room, but Reginald later testified he didn't take Jaylen to the doctor because it did not look serious at the time. This decision to deny medical care to an injured child would just be one of many failures that contributed to Jaylen's death. Now, April 30th, 2010 started like many other days in the household, but it would end with a 3-year-old fighting for his life. Let's walk through this day, hour by hour, based on trial testimony. So Thursday, April 29th, the children, Reginald's other kids, who had been staying at the house, they went home, leaving only Reginald, his girlfriend Shamika, and his son Jaylen. On the morning of April 30th, Calandra Tumlin, the sister, brought her children, ages 6 and 4, to stay for the day. According to Shamika's testimony, both Reginald and Calandra were in and out all day, while she remained at the residence with the children. At 6 p.m., Calandra drove Shamika to work at Church's Chicken, where she would work until closing at midnight. When Shamika left for work, she testified Jaylen was fine, but what happened in that house between 6 p.m. and 1 a.m. would prove to be the final assault on this little boy. According to Reginald's own statement to police, after Shamika left for work, his friend Cornell Watkins came over. They watched basketball for an hour. After Watkins left, Reginald said he played with Jaylen, but this was an innocent play. Reginald described this play as wrestling that included chewing. And during his police interview, Reginald also admitted that he touched Jaylen and even demonstrated the action to Detective Tate. The detective said he made his right hand into a fist, swung it backwards like a backhand. That's what he did to the kid. At some point during this play session, Jaylen had an accident in his pants and Reginald bathed and changed him. But the medical evidence would later show that the fatal injuries to Jaylen's abdomen occurred during this time period. Meanwhile, Calandra Tumlin brought pizza to the house for her children and Jaylen. She testified Jaylen ate 2 pieces of pizza and seemed fine. She was unaware of the violence that was occurring when she was present. Now, Shamika returned home from work around 1 a.m. on May 1st, 2010. According to her testimony, when she arrived, Jaylen was lying on the bed and greeted her, appearing fine. She changed her clothes, went into the living room, where she smoked a cigarette, and her and Reginald discussed their day. But she didn't realize Jaylen was far from fine. There was a brutal assault that he endured hours earlier. It caused massive internal injuries that were now life-threatening. At some point, they heard a noise and turned down the TV to call Jaylen. He responded, so they assumed he was okay and they continued watching TV. But about 30 minutes later, Jaylen moaned again. This time, Shamika went to check on him and brought him back to the living room. What they found was a child in severe distress. Jaylen told them his stomach is hurting, so Reginald warmed some rice to try to feed him. But Jaylen could only take one bite slowly and wouldn't chew the second bite. Shamika had to remove the uneaten food from his mouth with her finger to prevent him from choking. Both Shamika and Reginald claimed they were confused about Jaylen's condition because he'd been fine all day, but the medical evidence would later show Jaylen had been suffering from internal injuries for hours. Shamika then called Calandra. She said, "Jaylen is not well. Can we borrow your car? We need to take him to the hospital." Calandra arrived at the house. She found Reginald holding Jaylen. Reginald told her to listen, and she noticed that Jaylen's breathing was not normal. She told Reginald he needed to take Jaylen to the hospital immediately. But here's where Reginald's true character was revealed. Despite his son being in obvious medical distress, Reginald refused to go to the hospital. He later claimed this was because he was afraid of being arrested on his outstanding warrants. But the evidence suggests he was more afraid of medical personnel seeing Jaylen's injuries and asking questions. So instead of rushing his dying son to the hospital himself, Reginald sent Shamika to drive Jaylen to the emergency room while he stayed behind. This decision to prioritize his own freedom over his son's life speaks volumes. Now at 3 a.m. on May the 1st, 2010, Shamika arrived at the Children's Hospital carrying Jaylen. What the medical staff saw when she walked through those doors was horrific. Jamie Bowles, a nurse, was the first to treat Jaylen. She testified that Shamika was upset when she brought Jaylen to the emergency room, but Shamika's emotional state paled in comparison to Jaylen's physical condition. Bowles described Jaylen as pale and not breathing. She would immediately see marks on him, and her first impression was seeing the child who was dead. She immediately took Jaylen to a trauma room, checked for a pulse. Finding none, she began chest compressions. According to emergency room records, Jaylen was pronounced dead at 3:34 p.m., just 15 minutes after arriving at the hospital. And despite the medical team's best efforts, including chest compressions, artificial respiration, intubation, and 2 rounds of epinephrine, Jaylen never regained a heartbeat. He was declared dead on arrival. But it was Nurse Bowles' description of Jaylen's injuries that would truly reveal the horror of what he went through. There was multiple injuries and abrasions on his arms, behind his ears, on his face, on his legs. There were teeth marks, there was injuries on his legs, and a place on one of his legs from where it looked like a scar, there was a healing scorch mark. And they were all these injuries were in different stages of healing. This last detail, that the marks were in different stages, was crucial. It meant Jaylen didn't suffer just one singular injury, this was ongoing. Kristen Goodin, another registered nurse who was in the trauma room, observed extensive marks, teeth marks on Jaylen's arms, fingernail marks on his ears, scorch marks on the back of his leg, and based on her experience, she testified that the injuries were consistent with inflicted injuries, and this was not an accident. Sam Kreitz, a respiratory therapist who attempted to resuscitate Jaylen, noted the child had a slightly blue hue and no spontaneous respirations. Jaylen's pH was less than 6.5, far below the normal range of 7.3 needed for normal body function. Dr. Dale Dubois, an expert in pediatric medicine and the treating physician at Erlanger Emergency Room, provided crucial testimony about Jaylen's condition and injuries. His medical expertise would help paint a clear picture of the abuse Jaylen suffered. He testified that Jaylen had considerable marks covering his extremities, his upper body, his face, and his ears. The injuries were in multiple stages, confirming the injuries were inflicted at different times. One of the most telling pieces of evidence was the condition of Jaylen's pupils. The doctor noted that they were fixed and dilated, indicating Jaylen had been dead for some time, approximately an hour before arriving at the hospital. This meant that Jaylen had been without oxygen to his brain for about an hour, suggesting he actually died at home and the trip to the hospital was futile. The doctor also observed a tooth mark on Jaylen's shoulder that was 3 inches wide and very deep with broken skin. He testified that this tooth mark was inconsistent with being inflicted by another 3-year-old the mark and the shape of the mark could have only come from an adult. But the most significant finding was Jaylen's ruptured bowel. The doctor explained the symptoms associated with a ruptured bowel would include significant pain, fever, and vomiting. While it was possible for a child to survive this kind of injury, the doctor noted that the bowel was degloved and it was off and ruptured in several places. This is probably why the boy was moaning so much. And given the level of injury to his bowel, making successful surgery would have been unlikely even if it had been attempted. The doctor was clear in his professional opinion. Jaylen's injuries were not consistent with a fall or an accident. No other child could have done this to him. This was deliberate and this was done by an adult. And the full extent of Jaylen's suffering became clear during the autopsy performed by Dr. James Metcalf. He was the chief medical examiner for Hamilton County. His findings will provide the definitive evidence of what Jaylen endured in his final weeks of life. The doctor determined that the manner of death was homicide and the cause of death was bowel perforations due to blunt force abdominal trauma. He described this trauma as a very substantial force, not the type of injury a child might sustain during normal play. The timeline of Jaylen's injuries was also disturbing. Metcalf estimated that the holes in Jaylen's intestine had been present for 8 to 12 hours before his death. Other injuries in the abdominal cavity may have been present for 4 or 5 days. This meant that Jaylen had been suffering from these internal injuries for days before he finally succumbed. Metcalf found evidence of systematic mistreatment throughout Jaylen's small body. Blunt force injury to the abdomen with rupture to the small intestine. There were marks on the small intestine, head, neck, trunk, and all 4 extremities. There were teeth marks throughout his body, third-degree scald marks consistent with cigarette burns, injuries under the scalp, subdural bleeding underneath the thick covering of the brain, subarachnoid hemorrhage, which is bleeding under the thin cover of the brain. I mean, it's like this bastard left no stone unturned. Reginald, that is. Metcalf stated that the injuries to Jaylen's abdomen would have caused severe pain and rigidity of the abdominal wall, requiring immediate medical attention. Yet Jaylen never received the care he needed. Perhaps most heartbreaking was Metcalf's description of the totality of all the injuries. He called it a hailstorm of injury, like raining blows. He observed injuries in various stages of healing, meaning some were old, some were new, some were ongoing. There was a great deal of injury to the back of Jaylen's body, and Metcalf considered the presence of multiple separate injuries in determining the manner of death as homicide. The nature and severity of these injuries were not consistent with an accident. Remarkably, despite all of this trauma, there was no fractures to Jaylen's skeletal system, suggesting that while the incidents were severe and ultimately fatal, it may have been calculated to avoid leaving certain types of evidence. While medical personnel were fighting to save Jaylen's life, Detective James Tate of the Chattanooga Police Department was beginning what would become a homicide investigation. Tate responded to Erlanger Hospital on a call about a deceased child. He first spoke with Dr. Dubois, the treating physician, and then with Shamika Greer, who had brought Jaylen to the hospital. Immediately, Tate noticed something different. Reginald, Jaylen's father, wasn't there. When a child is brought to the hospital in a critical condition, it's natural for both parents to be present, if possible, considering they were living in the same house at the time. Reginald's absence was a red flag. Tate had Shamika transported to the police center, where a recorded interview was conducted. I did ask for this interview, they refused to give it to me. Tate also spoke with Calandra, Reginald's sister, who gave a statement that was inconsistent with Shamika's account. Another red flag indicating the stories weren't adding up. But the biggest red flag was Tate was unable to locate Reginald. Where was he? In fact, he would not be able to contact him until May the 18th, almost 3 weeks later. It's clear this wasn't a grieving father who was cooperating with police to find out what happened to his son. This was a man who had gone into hiding the moment his son died. Now, crime scene investigator Greg Mardis documented the scene at the hospital, then went to the residence. He took photographs and video recordings of the premises and collected potential evidence, including 2 space heaters. The investigation was methodical and thorough, but was also a race against time to find Reginald before he could flee the jurisdiction entirely. For 17 days, Reginald Tumlin successfully evaded police. This was not a man who was unaware police wanted him. This was someone who was actively hiding. So Officer Tim Pickard from the Chattanooga Police took over the search. He spoke with Jaylen's mother. He also spoke with Reginald's girlfriend, Shamika, and the mother of Reginald's other children. He also spoke with family members and close friends of Reginald. None of these people claimed to know Reginald's whereabouts. But finally, on May 17, 2010, they received information that Reginald was staying at an apartment. They set up a surveillance of the apartment for a couple of hours, and at 6 a.m., May 18th, approximately 10 officers, including several US Marshals, surrounded the building to ensure Reginald couldn't escape. They began knocking on the door and windows of the apartment, and approximately after 30 minutes, Reginald's uncle, James Pickett, answered the door, told police Reginald is in the back bedroom area. When officers found Reginald, they also found his disguise. He had a hat and a wig that were lying under the couch where his uncle indicated Reginald had been sleeping. This wasn't someone who was simply avoiding police due to outstanding warrants. This was someone who had gone to elaborate lengths to avoid detection. The fact that Reginald had been using a disguise to avoid police while his son's death was being investigated speaks volumes about his consciousness of guilt. An innocent father would have been at the police station demanding answers, not hiding in the back bedroom wearing a wig. When Reginald was finally brought to the police station, Tate read him his rights and Reginald signed a waiver. What followed was a confession, and while not admitting to the murder, he revealed the mistreatment that led to Jaylen's death. Reginald told police Jaylen had been in his custody since April 4th, nearly a month. He explained that Jaylen's mother had difficulty potty training him, so she allowed Jaylen to stay with Reginald for this purpose. He stated that the only people caring for Jaylen during this time was himself, Shamika, and on occasion, a grandmother. Reginald's account was particularly revealing. He said after Shamika left for work around 6 p.m., his friend, Cornell Watkins, came over and they watched basketball. After Watkins left, Reginald played with Jaylen, but his description of play isn't the normal play. He described it as wrestling, chewing, and said, "Doesn't everyone do this?" No, bitch, not everyone does. More significantly, he told police that he touched Jaylen and actually demonstrated the action for Tate. This is when he got his fist, swung it back and forth. This wasn't a gentle tap or normal parental discipline. This was a violent striking motion that could easily cause injuries. Reginald also admitted that at some point Jaylen had an accident in his pants, and he bathed and changed him. Given the timeline established by the medical examiner, this is likely when the abdominal injuries occurred. He probably got mad at the boy for pooping his pants. When asked about the events after Shamika came home, Reginald didn't say much, but he did reveal something crucial. He told Tate that he didn't go to the hospital with Jaylen because he was afraid of the police seeing him. This is damning because it shows Reginald was aware there were a whole bunch of injuries. An innocent father whose child was accidentally injured wouldn't be afraid of personnel seeing him. Beyond his confession, Reginald's behavior after Jaylen's death provided clear evidence of his consciousness of guilt. This wasn't a grieving father seeking justice for his son. This was a man trying to avoid responsibility for his actions. First, there was his immediate flight after Jaylen's death. While Shamika was at the hospital with Jaylen, Reginald disappeared. He didn't go to the hospital to be with his dying son, and he did not contact police to find out what happened. He was hiding. And Sergeant Bill Phillips testified that both the Fugitive unit and the US Marshals had to assist in locating Reginald. This wasn't someone who was simply hard to reach. This was someone actively evading law enforcement. Now, when Reginald was finally found, he was wearing a wig and a hat as a disguise. He later admitted to police that he knew they were looking for him, and that he used the wig to disguise himself. He even bragged about successfully avoiding detection while wearing the disguise, telling officers that he had seen police while wearing the items and they didn't recognize him. Detective Adam Emery testified that when he saw the wig and hat at the police station, Reginald responded that he had purchased the items to disguise himself and had successfully worn them to remain undetected. Detective Matthew Pugliese noted Reginald actually chuckled. He laughed as he told officers about being undetected. This behavior is completely inconsistent with that of an innocent father. Someone whose child had died accidentally would be cooperating with police and not playing cat and mouse games while wearing disguises. Perhaps most revealing was a recorded jail phone call between Reginald and Shamika. This was played for the jury. In this call, Reginald talked about watching police surveillance, trying to mislead them, and even attempting to send police to the wrong location by calling in false tips. In the call, Reginald said, "Man, I even tried to send the police somewhere else. Cheeky bastard." In fact, he called police and he sent the police to the Woodlawns. He's over there. This shows a calculated effort to evade capture. And when it came time for the defense to present their case, they faced an uphill battle. The medical evidence was overwhelming. Reginald's own statements were damaging, and his behavior after Jaylen's death suggested guilt. But they tried to paint the picture of a loving father whose rough play with his children had gone too far. By accident, Shamika testified on Reginald's behalf, describing him as someone who had never hurt or injured Jaylen. She maintained that she had never seen Reginald become angry with Jaylen during the potty training process, and that while she had seen Reginald bite Jaylen, it was in a playful way. Shamika tried to explain away some of Jaylen's injuries as coming from normal childhood activities. She suggested that some of the injuries could have come from Jaylen's mom's house, and maintained that not all of the marks depicted in the photographs happened at their home. Calandra, the sister, testified that she had been at the house on April 30th, and that the children were all playing together, running back and forth, falling off bikes. She said she didn't notice any abnormal behavior from Jaylen, but perhaps most significantly, Reginald himself took the stand in his own defense. This, of course, is a risky move from someone so stupid. He's got an extensive criminal record. You're going to get torn apart on the stand, young man. So he testified about his 8 children and described their play as rough play, including wrestling, chewing, and jumping off beds. He maintained this was normal behavior in his household. And regarding the night of April 30th, Reginald stuck to his story about playing with Jaylen after Shamika left for work. He continued to characterize the violence as normal play, though he disagreed with Tate's interpretation of how he had demonstrated touching his children. The fist motion. When confronted with the photographs of Jaylen's injuries, Reginald tried to minimize them. About the chew marks, he stated, "Some of the marks were old, and I've chewed him 2 or 3 times." He denied that some of the marks were chew marks at all, in fact, offering speculation that it was the other children that did some of them. Reginald suggested that Jaylen's various injuries could have come from falling on gravel while running from the dog or playing in the bushes. When he was shown what appeared to be a cigarette mark, he claimed he had no idea where it was from, suggested it might have occurred when Jaylen fell on something outside. But most tellingly, when asked directly if he took his son's life, he said, "No, sir, I love my son. Why would I do that?" Now, the prosecution's cross-examination of Reginald was devastating. They systematically dismantled his claim of innocence and exposed him. The prosecution first established that Reginald and Shamika were the sole caregivers, nearly a month during which the abuse occurred. They got Reginald to admit that he sold drugs for income, painting a picture of a household supported by criminal activity. They also established that he had been living a transient lifestyle, moving between 3 different locations. When it came to the injuries, the prosecution pressed Reginald on each one. They got him to admit that the injuries on Jaylen's leg looked serious, yet he never taken the child to a doctor. His excuse was that it didn't look serious at the time, but this was contradicted by the medical evidence, showing it was a 2nd-degree scorch. The prosecution also got Reginald to admit that 2 of the 3 marks on Jaylen's body were for him chewing him, but he claimed not to know what the other marks were. This partial admission was significant because they established he had been chewing the child. And perhaps most damaging was when the prosecution got Reginald to describe Jaylen's condition on the night he died. Reginald agreed Jaylen made noises he had never made before. He choked on water. Shamika had to remove food from his mouth, and that he was breathing funny. Despite all these obvious signs of medical distress, Reginald claimed he was concerned but not worried. The prosecution also established Jaylen never responded when Reginald held him and asked, "What's wrong, little boy?" This showed the child was already in severe distress, yet Reginald still did not take him to the hospital. Finally, they got Reginald to admit that after Jaylen went to the hospital, he didn't live nowhere and probably spending the night places when he ran away, confirming he had gone into hiding after his son's death. So after hearing all the evidence, the jury had to decide whether Reginald was responsible. The medical evidence was clear. Jaylen had died from mistreatment from multiple injuries. The question was whether the jury would hold Reginald accountable. Eventually, they convicted Reginald on multiple charges: 2 counts of child mistreatment, 1 count of criminally negligent homicide, 1 count of aggravated child neglect, and notably, the jury did not convict him of the most serious charge of felony murder, instead finding him guilty of criminally negligent homicide. This suggests, while they believed he was responsible, they may not have found that he intended to take the boy's life. So they sentenced him to 2 12-year sentences, a 6-year sentence for the criminally negligent homicide conviction, and a 60-year sentence for aggravated child neglect. These sentences are ordered to be served concurrently in the Tennessee Department of Corrections. This was essentially a life sentence. The judge clearly wanted to ensure that he would never again have the opportunity to harm a child. Now, Reginald appealed his conviction, but the court upheld the jury's verdict. The evidence against him was just simply too overwhelming, and the case left the community grappling with how a father could do this to his own child. It did raise questions about systems that are supposed to protect children. Jaylen had been in his father's custody for only a month, during which all of this happened. In that time, his biological mom only called twice to see how he was doing. And there are questions of Calandra, because she must have recognized what was going on. This case also highlighted the vulnerability of children in households where domestic violence and criminal activity are normalized. Shamika's casual acceptance of being chewed by Reginald and her description of it as normal behavior shows how violence can become normalized in dysfunctional relationships. Reginald is never going to get out. So comment, tell me what you think.